This man survived a bombing in the Middle East, got punched in the face by Michael Jordan, is a more efficient three-point shooter than Steph Curry, and he hit one of the biggest shots in finals history. This man is Steve Kerr, the Lord of the Rings, with 9 NBA championships. Only 5 people in NBA history have won more titles than the Warriors' head coach. But is he really one of the greatest winners ever? Or was he just lucky to be surrounded by world-class talent? How good was Steve Curry actually compared to every other NBA player of his era? Steve Kerr had a highly unusual childhood. His father, Malal Kerr, was a professor at UCLA specializing in Middle Eastern politics, but because he was also teaching at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon, the Kerr family spent their time between California and the Middle East. However, for 2 years, Steve also lived in Egypt. 1 year, he was schooled in France, and he spent his summers touring around Europe in a family Volkswagen van. But wherever he was, the only constant thing in Steve's life was sports, and he was obsessed with baseball and basketball, although it wasn't easy to watch him play, and it's not because he wasn't talented. Steve was good with excellent hand-eye coordination, but he was also a spoiled brat. As soon as something went wrong, he'd yell and argue, and we can sometimes see a glimpse of that temper when he's on the Warriors bench. Thankfully, as he grew older, Steve started to calm down, and yet one thing remained the same. It was the driveway in front of his house with a basketball hoop bolted to the roof above the garage where Steve spent countless hours practicing, and it all paid off. Despite being fairly skinny and unathletic with a modest 6'3" height, Steve could shoot lights out. And because of his shooting, he received a scholarship to the University of Arizona under the legendary Coach Lott. Olsen then, in that summer of 1983, after he graduated high school, and before he became a Wildcat, Steve decided to join his family in Lebanon. His father became the president of the American University in Beirut, but there was also a civil war that had just started. Despite the political turmoil, Steve missed his family, and he wanted to be with them. Because of his father's status, the Kerrs had a largely stress-free summer. But right when Steve wanted to return to the States, the harsh reality of war hit him with a full blast. Just as he was preparing to board his plane, the airport was bombed. We were in the terminal, and all of a sudden there was a blast. It wasn't in the terminal, but on the runways. The whole place just froze. My mom grabbed me, and I remember running out of the terminal and through the parking lot. It was really scary. Steve was in a panic, and the Kerr family ran back to their home. And Steve was stuck because all the runways were damaged. After several unsuccessful tries to board him on military planes, the university driver of his father ultimately drove him over the mountains to Syria. It was an incredibly risky trip, but Steve got away unscathed. Landing in California a few days later when the basketball season started, Steve had a pretty unimpressive freshman year, averaging just 7 points in 22 minutes on the court. But what hurt Steve more than the numbers was that his family couldn't be there to watch him play, and little did he know that his father would never see him play live. It was 3 a.m. on January 18, 1984, and Steve received the worst phone call of his life that morning in Beirut, just like he would on any other workday. His father was walking down the hallway to his office, and then it happened. Malcolm Kerr, the president of American University in Beirut, was gunned down in his school today, the latest victim of Liz's seemingly endless violence. Malcolm Kerr was shot twice in the back of his head. It was a huge shock to me, even given the situation in Beirut. I knew how dangerous it was while all his family attended his father's funeral. Steve decided to stay in Arizona. Even more surprisingly, just 2 days after Malcolm got assassinated, Steve played in a basketball game. This sounds bad. The basketball wasn't more important, but the logistics were tricky, and it was cathartic for me to just play. The only time I didn't think about my father was on the court the whole game. I was thinking of my dad, and I had dedicated the game to him, privately. Not only did Steve play, but he had the best game of his career after a painful minute of silence in honor of his father. Kerr stepped onto the court and hit his first shot, finishing 5 for 7 from the field in a surprise win over Arch, rival Arizona State, in the next 2 seasons. K's numbers improved drastically, and in 1986, his junior season, Steve was averaging 4 points, 4 assists on a phenomenal 57% shooting, and 90% from the free throw line. His competitiveness and shooting stroke earned him an invite to the 1986 World Cup, where Team USA won gold. Steve was the fourth leading scorer on that team, behind David Robinson. Kenny Smith and Charles Smith before the 1987 NCAA season. Kerr tore his ACL, which could have been the end of his basketball dreams. But Steve recovered in time for the 1988 season and was playing better than ever, putting up a shooting clinic night after night while Kerr was injured. The NCAA introduced the three-point line, and in his first season with the three-pointer, Steve immediately set the NCAA single-season record for three-point percentage with 57.3% hitting 114 threes, a total record that wouldn't be broken for 2 decades. However, during that same season, Kerr suffered the toughest moment of his career during pre-game warm-ups against Arizona TI. Kerr was taunted by Sun Devils fans with chants that included, "Where's your father?" and PLO, which was the acronym for the political activists that killed Malcolm Kerr. There were about 10 or 12 students yelling, "Where's your father?" Steve broke down and burst into tears, but then he picked himself up, and that anger that he played with throughout his childhood came to the surface. I rarely have a vindictive thought in my mind when I'm playing basketball, but that was probably the one game where I did, and I've never seen anything like it. Kerr played like he was possessed, scoring 20 points in the first half and making all 6 of his three-point attempts in a blowout win later that season. Steve helped the Wildcats reach the first Final Four in school history, after which he declared for the NBA draft when he was finishing high school. Making the NBA was far-fetched for Kerr, as he barely even made it to college. "I was just hoping to play college ball somewhere. There's no way we ever imagined that I would be playing in the NBA, but through hard work and impeccable shooting, Steve was good enough that the Sun picked him up in the second round with the 50th overall pick. I'm not an overly spiritual person, but sometimes I think maybe he's pulling a few strings up there, and that's why I ended up making it. But because he was physically inferior to almost every other player in the league, Steve spent his rookie season glued to the bench, scoring just 54 points for the entire season. However, Steve was a fighter, and when he got traded to the Cavs the next season and finally got some more playing time, he used his opportunity to the fullest despite his physical shortcomings. Steve was still a sniper from the outside. Kerr led the NBA in three-point percentage, making an unbelievable 51% of his threes. Steve would spend 3 years in Cleveland, and his 47% from deep is still the Cavs franchise record. After a short stint with rookie Shaq in Orlando, Steve reached the biggest turning point of his career, signing for the Chicago Bulls for a minimum of $150,000 per season. Despite the small salary, Kerr got a unique opportunity to play alongside one of the greatest basketball players in history and absorb the knowledge of one of the best coaches in history over the next 5 years. Kerr would prove to be one of the steadiest role players in the NBA with 378 consecutive games played for the Bulls, during which he set several NBA records in 1995. Kerr became the first player in NBA history who shot over 50% from the field and 50% from three. However, the Bulls lost to the Magic in the second round, and Jordan was pissed, so Michael spent the whole summer pumping iron and playing pickup on the set of Space Jam. By the time he went back to the Bulls training camp in September, Jordan was in the best shape of his life. By the time camp started, he was in incredible shape, but he was also like frothing at the mouth. More importantly, MJ wanted the same from his teammates and demanded perfection in practice. So every day at Hawaii, training camp was just a war. Every day was a battle, and he talked a lot of... One day, Phil Jackson put Kerr up to guard. Michael and MJ immediately started trash-talking Steve, pushing him around. In the post, I have a lot of patience as a human being, but I tend to snap at some point because I'm extremely competitive too. I'm going to fight. But even though he was 5 inches shorter and 40 lbs lighter, Steve was as competitive as hell, and he wasn't going to back down. So he pushed Michael back, and unlike Draymond Green and Jordan Poole, Steve and Michael's relationship improved after a punch at practice.